Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming at you, Film Fanatic, live and direct. It is Friday at about 9 o'clock. So I hope everyone's doing good. It's actually kind of snowy. It started snowing last night. We got a couple inches. We actually got probably 2 or 3 inches, and it's actually sticking. And it stopped a while ago, and now it's snowing again. So it's kind of nice to actually have some snow. So today is my first day of vacation. We are on February break already. So yeah, it's pretty cool. I got some plans to. I'm gonna go to Bull Moose. I think on Saturday, get some new movies, and I think I'm gonna get go out of town for a couple of days or so, and just kind of relax a little bit, get some work in, and so it'll be fun. And so, like I've said before in the past in a lot of videos, I try to always am thinking of new things that I can do to kind of add some variety to the show. Always keeping things, of course, centered on my love of film and all those things. And the primary focus of this channel is to bring to the table or shed some light on the world of like horror exploitation, basically movies that I just love and love and love, and that I'm just that are my favorite films. But also to share that passion, but then to maybe bring light to some movies that are not talked about, or people who have a deep love or a deep connection to film, to maybe share some ideas or movies that are just not really talked about. And that's the main focus of the channel. And but with that being said, I try to bring variety. As far as I also love big budget films, big budget Hollywood films, quote unquote commercial films, documentaries, music. I try to bring in a music factor to the show. But today is going to be a first. Today I'm doing like a top tier, my favorite horror exploitation movies of all time. It's probably the most, I guess, ambitious show I've ever done. I have never really done a show like this because I find it kind of daunting and honestly just kind of intimidating, because I love a lot of different kinds of films, and we all have our to go films, maybe a list that of films that we've seen the most or whatnot. But for me, it's pretty hard. I don't, a big thing that you see on YouTube and movie channels are these like top 10 lists or top tier lists where people will talk about 20 films that are the cat's meow for that person or persons. And for me, it's like I have a list, but it's pretty informal. There's definitely a top grouping of films, but I realized my idea behind the show that I started thinking of this idea yesterday. When I started putting together the films that I wanted to talk about, I was like, holy shit, this is hard. This is harder than I thought. So today's show is going to be about my informal list. It's a little bit uneven, but as far as numbers go, it's like 20, I think it's about 22 movies that I just ended up focusing on and that I want to focus on. And so this will be hopefully exciting and interesting, because all of these movies that I will be mentioning and talking about, I have done reviews on this channel before. So if you want more, if you dig this show and you want maybe a little bit more of a history or backstory about one or two of these particular movies, you can check it out on the rest of the channel. So yeah. So starting things off with this crazy odyssey, my favorite horror movie of all time, which again, picking my top five was actually pretty easy. The rest was hard. But the first five movies or so that I'm going to be talking about, I should say 5 to 10 movies I'm going to be talking about, was pretty easy. But, so hands down, my favorite horror exploitation movie of all time is The Tourist Trap, starring Chuck Connors. I have such a deep love for this film. It came out in 1979. It was directed by David Schmoller. It is, I don't know, it's such a goofy, strange, yet terrifying movie. There are certain scenes in this film. Well, one scene in particular, if you've never seen Tourist Trap, this movie is very silly, very campy, super uber low budget. Chuck Connors is the star. This movie was kind of made at the tail end of his career. His career was not going so well, and so he started doing exploitation movies. But he was a real, prominent figure in acting in the United States in the '60s, and also in the '70s, and also in the '50s. But this movie is so, like, bizarre, so ridiculous, so funny. But there's one or two scenes in this movie where I find that it's one of some of the most one of the most disturbing, creepy, the creepiest scenes ever that I've ever seen in a horror movie. I mean, just amazing. This movie has so much amazing atmosphere, amazing soundtrack. This is a wonderful edition of this movie. I have multiple copies of this movie. I have 2 or 3 copies of it on DVD, and I think, yeah, I even have it on VHS. This movie is an absolute masterpiece. Tourist Trap, without a doubt, hands down, my favorite horror exploitation movie of all time. And the other thing is, without trying to spend too much time on each movie because the show will go on for hours, this movie is also rated PG. It was not really released in the theaters when it came out because they were trying to get trying to get an R rating, but it does not have really any gore in it whatsoever. So it ended up getting basically a PG or a G rating, so it didn't get any real distribution. But when this movie was there was a deal struck for syndication on cable and TV at the time, and when this movie was shown on television, it became this kind of cult phenomenon, and this movie ended up becoming very, very successful. And I saw it when I was a kid on TV, and it's hard to believe that this movie was shown on TV because, again, I think there's some things in this movie that are truly kind of frightening and disturbing. So it's amazing. But Tourist Trap, 1979, the greatest. And again, super hard to make a top 10 list or a top 20 list of films because, again, so many movies. It's an informal list. It is formal at times, and it's kind of ever changing. But there's a lot of movies that are kind of tied for particular number or place in this list, like I'm doing. And a movie that I was kind of torn to say if it was number one or number two, but it's so close to being number one. But I'm going to probably put it in two. And this is one of my all-time favorite exploitation movies of all time, and that is Paul Bartel's Private Parts from 1972. This movie was so incredibly hard to find and track down. And I have this movie, I have a VHS copy of this movie I've seen it, multiple times. I remember trying to find this movie on Blu-ray, even DVD, online, and I could not find it anywhere. It was out of stock or just wasn't made by really any companies. And Scream Factory put this out, I believe, like a couple of years ago. And I found this. I got this pretty recently, and I was so freaking excited. I was to the moon when I found this, and it's an amazing edition of this film. I've never seen it. It's in 2K. There's a 4K edition of it also. It's absolutely gorgeous on Blu-ray. It came out in 1972. It was directed by Paul Bartel, who's kind of one of my favorite directors. This movie is such a demented little film. It's such a bizarre film. It's one of the strange. I think it's one of the weirdest and strangest movies ever made. It's like this very. It's a very much a psychosexual film, and it's super creepy. It's just got amazing atmosphere. It's uber low budget, and again, it's there's moments of this film that are just like totally absurd and ridiculous and terrible for all intents and purposes. But it's just got this thing about it and the story and certain characters, especially around the grandmother character, that are just like gives you goosebumps on how just kind of frightening and creepy it is. But again, this movie is a masterpiece. I love this movie to death, and I since I bought it along with say Tourist Trap, which I've had for a longer time on Blu-ray, I've watched this movie multiple times and amazing, great special features. There's lots of cool information about this movie, and out of all the movies I have, this was probably the hardest to find. So this is one of my all-time prized possessions in my collection. Amazing, amazing film. And I've said too, and within the world of horror exploitation, my favorite genre of all time is the slasher genre. Getting back to Tourist Trap, that movie is definitely a slasher movie, 100%. But I have to say, as far as, you know, a movie that is very genre specific, when it comes to a slasher movie, this movie right here, Maniac, which I believe I've done multiple shows on. Maniac from Bill Luswig, uh, to me is the greatest, hands down, no questions asked, the greatest slasher movie of all time. Deeply disturbing, brutal as all fuck, and entertaining as all hell. This was put out by Blue Underground, which is also Bill Luswig's company. He's the director of this film, an amazing director, one of my favorite directors, but he also started this really awesome company, Blue Underground, and put this out. This is an amazing edition of this film. It's 30 year anniversary. So many great special features and interviews. They truly don't make movies like this anymore. In 1980, it is one of the most brutal movies ever made. But as when it comes to slasher movies, this is hands down the greatest slasher movie of all time, Maniac. Check it out if you have never seen it. It's the ultimate in slasher horror. So my next film that I'm going to be talking about is a movie that I was so excited when I got it. I've had it for a few years. And when I saw this movie at Bull Moose in my travels, I think I did a little dance in the aisle. And again, this is a movie, one of my all-time favorite exploitation movies. I grew up watching this movie, just like Tourist Trap, which was a movie of my youth that I used to see all the time on cable. This is one of them. This, I think, just an amazing movie, and that, of course, is The Car. I believe I've done like 2 or 3 shows on this movie. Came out in 1977. It was directed by Elliot Silverstein. Of course, it stars the legendary Mr. Brolin, James Brolin to be exact. And so I had only seen this on cable as a kid growing up, and then for years and years and years I didn't see it. And then when I came across this on Blu-ray, I was just so blown away, and it's amazing. This is one of the most gorgeous looking films on Blu-ray I've ever seen. The cinematography for this movie is just simply spectacular. This movie is such an exploitation movie, and it's such a basically a Jaws knockoff, but it's so awesome. And I think it's generally it's a very intense movie, and it's actually a pretty scary movie. This movie always scared me when I was a kid. The actual car itself is amazing, and the car itself was modeled after Anton LaVey's car, who Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan. And there's actually a quote by Anton LaVey in the beginning of the film from the Church of Satan. An amazing movie. Such a great film. One of my all-time exploitation movies, hands down. And like I said, one of the most immaculate looking films that I've ever seen on Blu-ray. And pretty much I'd say too, the car is, at the end of the day, it's a slasher movie. So, but getting back to, I guess, more of a traditional slasher film, one of my all-time favorite movies, a movie probably in this list, out of all the movies in this list, is probably one of the most, to a degree, popular or most talked about movies, and that is the original My Bloody Valentine. This Canadian slasher movie is, I just think, a pure masterpiece. It came out in 1981, and it was directed by George Milhaka, and it is, an amazing Canadian slasher movie. There were so many great films that came out in the late 70s into the 80s from Canada that I've really gotten into, and this was probably the biggest and, to a degree, the most important, or one of the most important Canadian movies. But such a masterpiece. This steelbook edition of this amazing film on Blu-ray is just so gorgeous and spectacular. There's two different versions of the film on here. I have done at least one or two shows on My Bloody Valentine. I've never seen the remake, and I don't know. I'm not really a big fan of remakes of films. I think there are occasionally exceptions, but I've just kind of stayed away because I just love this movie. The thing that's so great about this movie is the atmosphere. It's generally creepy and actually scary. It's an amazing film, and this package, this steelbook edition, is just spectacular. Amazing, amazing film. This next film is also a movie that, like a lot of these other films I've already talked about, were movies that I saw all the time as a kid. They were on cable all the time. And this movie, a little bit of a different thing because this was actually made for TV, but I think it's actually one of the scariest and most atmospheric and one of the creepiest movies ever made. And that is Dark Knight of the Scarecrow. This movie is such a masterpiece. I don't really ever hear this movie talked about. When it comes to the Halloween season, people always talk. That's a big thing you see. Halloween is, of course, a very huge holiday. But as far as in terms of movies, there's tons of YouTube people that do their top 5 or top 20 movies to watch around Halloween, and I never hear this movie talked about. And I think, there's so many great movies to watch around the Halloween season, of course. But I think for me that this is probably the best one. This is the most atmospheric, and I think one of the just scariest, and one of the creepiest horror films ever made. It was made for television. It's super low budget, but it's kind of gritty. It's just an amazing story. It's essentially a ghost story, but it is such a damn good movie. I was so excited when I bought this on Blu-ray. This was a movie of my youth, one of my first kind of low-budget exploitation movies I ever saw. Amazing. It came out in 1981. It stars the great Charles Durning, great character actor. It just doesn't get better. And it was directed by Frank Di Fileta, or Frank De La Fita. Such a great director. He was also prominent in writing lots of screenplays and other films at the time, but masterpiece. And this edition is spectacular. There's so many great special features on here, but amazing, amazing movie. Easily on my top tier list, if you want to call it that. So most of the movies I've talked about so far are movies that I grew up watching, that I used to always see. They, for all intents and purposes, they were the first horror movies I ever saw. They were the first low budget exploitation movies I ever saw. I used to see them all the time as a kid. But there are quite a few movies in this list that I will be getting to that I literally saw for the first time, within the last couple of years. And since I've seen them, they've become, obsessions of mine, and I've seen them multiple times. So I'll be bouncing back and forth. A few of them are movies I did see as a kid, but a lot of them were brand new for me. So including this movie, which I think it's probably, when it comes to horror films, exploitation movies that have a quote unquote like a satanic, aesthetic, where there's lots of blood, there's human sacrifice and boobs and gore. That's also one of my favorite styles of exploitation. And this movie, Satan's Blood, this is a Spanish film. I saw this movie for the first time a couple of years ago. I bought it on a whim. I'd heard about this film, and I'm blown away by this movie every time I watch it. It came out in 1978. It was directed by Juan Picar Simon. It is one of the sleaziest, trashiest movies I've ever seen. It's super gory. It's super disturbing. It's so incredibly sleazy. And when it comes to the idea of black magic, the occult, it is, I think, the best that there is. It's an amazing movie. It has, it's very gory. It's very shocking. There's lots of gratuitous sex. There's orgies. I mean, what else? What else do you want in a movie? But this movie has I don't know. It kind of does remind me a little bit of Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby, but way more sleazy and way more just raw and dirty and nasty. And that, not at all knocking that masterpiece of a film, but when it comes to, satanic, quote unquote satanic themed horror films, this is for me the best one ever made. It is such an orgy of blood and fun. Satan's Blood, 78, and it's a Spanish film. This is a beautiful edition of this movie. It is such a satisfying movie and such a fun movie, and dirty. You feel like you kind of have to take a shower after you watch it, but amazing, amazing film. This next movie is a movie I had heard about through the years, but I had never seen it before. And I remember reading accounts where people were talking about how, this was one of their favorite horror exploitation movies, and that they used to see it on cable all the time as a kid. I remember, I never could remember, I never recalled seeing this movie, but I bought it on a whim on Blu-ray, and it instantly went to my top 5 or 10 list. Like, it's everything I'd heard about this movie, and to a degree the hype I heard around about this movie was true and then some. And that is, children shouldn't play with dead things. This movie is easily one of the greatest horror exploitation movies ever. Again, it is a movie that is very much steeped in. It has very much an occult element, but there are all. It's also a zombie movie at the same time, and it's super campy. It's a little bit more. Well, it's not. For instance, I just talked about Satan's Blood. With Satan's Blood is a like kind of a serious movie. This is a real goofy movie. It has some real wonderful and very generally creepy and scary moments and atmosphere, but it's super campy and it's like it's kind of like a I don't know, I look at this as almost being like a black comedy. It's super funny, but it does have some great horror elements that give it a little bit more of a serious tone. But this movie is a masterpiece, and it came out in 1972. It was directed by the legendary filmmaker Bob Clark, who has made so many great films. I also have one of his other films in this collection. Bob Clark, I think, was one of the best exploitation directors, and he also did movies in big budget Hollywood movies. And I think all around, one of the most important and one of the best directors ever. But when it comes to the exploitation, low budget horror films, I mean, he made some incredible classics. And this movie is such a masterpiece. This collection, never seen it before, like I said. I got it fairly recently and I've watched it multiple times already. And there is, it came out, this is the 50th anniversary, and it's two discs. There are so many special features on here. There's about 3 or 4 hours of special features. Amazing film. Highly recommend it. I think that this is one of the most, when it comes to like the horror exploitation world of filmmaking, I think that this is one of the most important movies ever made. And I see how this movie is one of the most influential on the entire genre. Amazing masterpiece. So this movie also that I'm going to be talking about right now is another movie I had never heard of. I went into this film totally cold. I was sold on coming across it in Apple Moose, and it just looked amazing. I was like, this movie just totally spoke to me as the movie that I need to own, and that is Tombs of the Blind Dead. One of the greatest horror exploitation movies ever made. It's it's a ghost story. It's totally an exploitation movie. It's a zombie movie also, but the atmosphere in this film and the practical effects, the cinematography in this movie is like, top shelf. I think this movie has some of the greatest like atmosphere I've ever seen in a movie. It was directed by Armando Diasario, and it's a Spanish film. And it came out in '72. I was so blown away when I realized that this film came out in '72 and how old this movie is, and just how rich it is and how creepy this movie is. The atmosphere. When it comes to exploitation movies, if the movie has just a rich atmosphere where it's so strong that you can kind of taste it, 10 times out of 10, I will be totally into that movie. This movie exemplifies that. It has some scenes in it, and the use of the cinematography, it's just so highly effective. One movie one of my all-time favorite movies by the great John Carpenter is The Fog. And I really think that this movie must have been something that John Carpenter had seen, because it really reminds me of what John Carpenter did in The Fog. As far as the use of the lighting, the atmosphere, lots of interesting parallels. Really hard pressed to. I'd be shocked if John Carpenter did not see this movie, as and that it didn't have an influence on that classic. But amazing movie. This is a beautiful edition. There's two versions of this film. There's a Spanish version and an American version. The Spanish version, I always go for the foreign language version if that's an option for a lot of these European movies, and it's way better than the American version. The American version is, it's not as good, but it's still good. But the Spanish version is just like spectacular. I just recently bought this. I don't know, maybe a few months ago, but instantly this movie for me was a masterpiece. Highly, highly recommend it. I've learned a lot about this movie and realizing how this movie was really regarded as a really big, influencer in the world of horror. It's iconic, and I think one of the most important movies in the genre. But amazing, amazing movie. Now, this next movie, again, I always bounce back and forth and try to cover. I'm obviously covering a lot of slasher movies. But I have to say, I was really late to the game with this movie, and I got into this movie. I bought this movie about a year ago, and it's become, again, an obsession of mine. I had always heard about this movie. For some odd reason, I never saw it. And I have to say that, again, there's so many movies in the genre of the slasher genre that are, of course, amazing and just incredible. And movies that are incredibly important. One of the most talked about movies is, of course, John Carpenter's Halloween that came out in '78. But I think overall, the most iconic film and probably the most important movie, hands down, in the style of the slasher genre, is Black Christmas. This movie is, just such an iconic movie. I think one of the most important. I think it's the most important slasher movie ever made. This was also made by Bob Clark. This came out in '72. I'm sorry, it did not come out in '72. It came out in 1974. It's a another Canadian horror film. Bob Clark, I believe, was American, but he shot a lot of his films in Canada. He used lots of Canadian actors. But I think, obviously before the year of '74, there were other slasher movies that did come out, especially in Europe. Jess Franco made slasher films before, and there's Herschel Gordon Lewis, of course, who is in this list without a doubt. So there have been, technically, their slasher movies were around before Black Christmas, but I think that this movie was acted as like the kind of this arrival of where there's this real definitive blueprint as to what a slasher movie is and what it can be, and what tropes of a movie qualify that movie as a slasher film, where it comes into its own as a particular style. And I think that this movie is that. And so therefore I think that because of this movie, because it brought all of those things to the table, I think hands down it's the most important and the most influential slasher movie of all time. So amazing, amazing movie. I was really late to the game with watching this movie or getting to see it. And I've seen this movie multiple times. This Blu-ray transfer is spectacular. So many great special features on here, but just again, in the genre of the slasher genre, which is my favorite genre of all time, hands down the most important movie ever. I think if this movie didn't exist, obviously the genre of slashers, the slasher genre would still exist, and it would still be a thing. But this movie really kind of ushered in a real aesthetic behind it, and the most important movie in the style. So this next movie is a movie that I bought a couple of years ago. I'd never seen it before, and again, it was one of those things. I was at Bull Moose, going through the aisles, and I was just completely sold on the cover, the artwork, the synopsis of this movie. This movie was put out by my favorite company of all time, Mondo Macabra. They specialize in these really low budget, super obscure, kind of European exploitation movies. And I think that this, getting back to another genre that I really love, or subgenre in exploitation, is the whole kind of, well, none exploitation, but the whole kind of satanic, horror based film genre, and that is Satanico Pandemonium. This movie is just amazing, and it is one of the most disturbing movies I've ever seen. I think it's easily, it's so goddamn sleazy and disturbing and messed up, but just amazing, amazing. And I bought this, like again, I bought this a couple of years ago. I've seen it multiple times. It came out in '75. It's a Spanish film, but this movie is such a masterpiece. I've watched this multiple times. This movie is shocking. There's a few moments in this film, a few scenes in this movie where you're just like, holy shit. There's no way that this movie could be made now. But this movie is one, when it comes to the, satanic themed horror, genre, one of the greatest. Satan's Blood, which I just talked about, and Satan's Blood and Satanico Pandemonium. It's a huge style in the horror genre, and I definitely think that these two movies are the greatest in that style. I think I would say the satanic occult-based horror films, along with slasher films, that those are my two favorite subgenres, if you will. Masterpiece. There's a lot of great special features on here. Mondo Macabra is the shit. Just like this movie, I highly recommend this movie. This movie is a fucking trip. Amazing, amazing movie. It's bonkers. And I'm sure you probably can realize or see that there's a theme here as far as when a lot of these movies come out. I've always said multiple times that the 70s is my favorite decade, and most of these movies are from the 70s. This next movie is a movie that I had heard about for actually a very, very long time, but I never actually seen it. And I think that this movie is kind of the quintessential exploitation horror movies of all time. It's got everything you want when you throw in an exploitation movie. It's got copious amounts of boobs and nudity, copious amounts of violence, and some great car chase scenes. What else do you need? And this movie is, again, another masterpiece, and that is Mardi Gras Massacre. I just did a show, a second show, actually, about this movie the other day that I haven't uploaded yet. And this came out in '78, directed by Jack Weiss, who is a director I also discovered this year. I have a few of his other movies. He's actually one of my favorite directors right now. All of his movies are always shot in New Orleans. This movie is just, again, I think it's one of the greatest exploitation movies. It's got all of those elements and so fucking entertaining. And the first time I saw this movie, the violence of it, I was kind of shocked. I have a high threshold for violence, and I was just like, "Wow, holy shit! They're going for it." The music for this film is just amazing. It's got all this great funk, disco, track. Everything has that disco kind of, semi porn kind of feel to it. The transfer of this on Blu-ray is spectacular. It looks amazing, and again, a recent discovery for me, and I have just fallen in love with this movie. I think that this is one of the most important and one of the greatest movies in the world of horror exploitation, without a doubt. Anybody looking to get into making a horror exploitation movie or wanting to find out, what qualifies as an exploitation movie, this is it. and returning to my favorite genre of all time, the slasher genre. Again, I've been covering. I realized too, a lot of these movies are European movies, and there are so many great masterful films that came out of Spain during this time of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And this movie right here, Pieces, is one of the greatest in the slasher genre. This is an essential movie. If you're into slasher movies, or really if you're into horror movies, this movie is like a holy book. Like, this is essential. It came out in 1982. The violence is completely shocking and brutal. Amazing, amazing atmosphere. It's got some of the greatest kills ever created. This is such an amazing package. I remember seeing this movie a few times as a kid. Not a lot compared to some of the earlier movies, but I remember seeing this movie as a kid, and I always loved it. So when I picked this beautiful, beautiful edition, it's 3 discs. It's spectacular. There's documentaries. There's a whole documentary on just during this decade of the 70s and 80s in New York City, what it was like when the Grindhouse theater experience was a thing. Amazing, amazing. And this is probably in my collection one of my most one of the best things that I have. One of the most prized possessions that I have. But I think that this is easily one of the greatest slasher movies ever made, and I think it's one of the most influential and one of the most important. It's a Spanish film, and it was directed by Juan Picor Simon. And again, easily one of the most important movies ever made. I've done, I think, 2 shows about Pieces. There's, again, one of the factors for me when I buy a Blu-ray of one of these movies is if it has special features. And all of these movies typically have tons of great special features. This one is insane. There's like 3.5 hours or something like that. Like, it's crazy. There's like 2 discs dedicated to just information that, people, nerds like me, that love. And it's amazing. And again, it's one of those things. There's 2 different versions of this film. There's a Spanish version, and then there's the American version. The American version's not for. I'm not a fan of the American version. I always watch the Spanish version. It's so much better. It's so much better. Like, the story's more cohesive. But this movie's super raw, super nasty. The kills are just spectacular. This movie is pretty popular. It's talked about quite a bit, but it is, all the accolades that this movie has gotten and all the praise. Totally spot on. A brilliant, brilliant film. And again, I said, Canada. There are so many great horror exploitation movies that came out of Canada in the 70s and 80s. And this was a movie that was put out by Severn. Severn's one of the best companies out there, specializing in all things exploitation. I have a ton of, Severn movies and titles. And this was a Canadian movie that I had never seen before, and I bought it on a whim, and it just looked amazing. And again, I've seen this movie so many freaking times I can't even count. And that is Siege. This this movie is such a badass movie. It's kind of got this like post-apocalyptic vibe, really disturbing and just amazing. Just such an awesome movie in every way. This transfer, this package, is just so spectacular. This is a movie that again, you hear it said a lot, but this is a movie that probably couldn't be made today. This came out in 1983. It's one of the grittiest. It's one of the nastiest. It's got some amazing kills in it. It's brutal as all hell, but it's so suspenseful. It's such a great suspense laden film. I mean, great characters. total, exemplifies guerrilla filmmaking. It's so raw. But this movie is so badass. It's one of my all-time favorites. I discovered it, like I said, just recently, last couple of years. I've watched this film multiple, multiple times. Um, can't get enough of this movie. I think it's, when it comes to exploitation movies, and especially all the, incredible movies that came out of Canada, this is one of the most important films ever. It was directed by Paul Donovan and Maria O'Connell, and it's god damn, such a damn good movie. I never hear this movie, and it came out in '82. I never hear this movie talked about very often, but it's it's amazing. It exemplifies everything in the world of exploitation. It's so low budget, but it's so, I don't know, the characters are so great. It's got so much suspense in it. The opening sequence of this film is just spectacular. And again, there are two versions of this film. There's an American version and also a Canadian version. Not a big fan of the American version. It's the same thing. If I have the option, I always watch the original, like, European version of it. And the Canadian version of this movie is so badass. It's got some incredible music. The kills in this movie are just like amazing and so entertaining. It's such a great film. I think it's one of the best films that Severin has ever released. This next movie is a movie that I did see a bunch of times when I was a kid, and then when I came across it on Blu-ray, I did a little dance. I was super excited. And this movie is such a hot mess, and it's such a piece of trash. But again, it's one of those things that it strikes that balance, between being so terrible but yet brilliant at the same time. And that is the one and only Spookies. This is like such a crazed movie. It's got such a kind of this legendary cult status about it. This movie was such a train wreck. Multiple directors were involved in this film. Somehow it got put out anyway. So it's like you can just see it. You can just see on so many levels on how this movie was a failure. But this movie is, again, it's got that balance, and I just think that this movie is one of the best movies in the exploitation world. It's super campy. It's completely surreal and completely ridiculous. It's got all these elements of where there's like amazing creature design. It's a monster movie. It's a slasher movie. It's a zombie movie. It's got all of these different kinds of genres all packed into this. It's got like an occult supernatural vibe to it. It's super campy. I mean, next level, and it's super funny. It's a really funny movie. I kind of think of this movie as being more of a black comedy than anything. It came out in 1986. Again, it's such a masterpiece. This edition of this film on Blu-ray is completely spectacular. Brendan Folker and Thomas Doran were responsible for this hot mess. The special features on here are just amazing. The story of how this movie was made and conceived, and then what happened to the film, and then all of the people that worked on the film that were either quit or were fired, is almost more entertaining than the movie, and just kind of mind-blowing. This is one of my favorite Blu-rays that I own in my collection. It's kind of jaw-dropping. It's such a jaw-dropping film that is it's one of those stories where you're like, you can't believe that this actually happened in real life, and how did this fucking movie ever get made and actually get released? And considering how, like, for all intents and purposes, this movie is like kind of a pile of shit. It's like one of the most. It's a gorgeous pile of shit. Like, like, it's so funny because I love, from a production standpoint, from a direction standpoint, from the the way this movie was financed, everything, from top to bottom, it was in a complete and utter state of chaos the entire time. And but I think, as fucked up as it was, and people like not making money and just getting fucked over, the end result, I don't know, I made this movie into this amazing gem. I think if it was put together by a, I guess, quote unquote professional, film crew, or if it was handled in a less chaotic way, in a more traditional sense, this film would not have been good. I think that it just adds to the ridiculousness of the movie, and just how ludicrous this movie is, but it's amazing, and this is one of my all-time favorites. I've I bought this. I saw it. I remember seeing it as a kid a few times, and then I got this recently. Well, I've had it for a couple of years, few years. I've watched this multiple times. Love, love, love this movie. One of the best. So entertaining. It's a horror movie. It's got all kinds of elements, but I look at this as being definitely a comedy. It's super silly, and it's so ridiculous. It's I think it's one of those movies you have to see to believe. It's yeah, it's amazing, amazing. Can't recommend this movie enough. So this next movie in this giant list, this is coming to about 23 movies, I think. This next movie is a movie I'd never seen before, and it's a director that I there were a handful of his movies that I saw as a kid. One specifically I remember seeing a lot as a kid is a movie that he did called Facelift, which is just, again, just an incredible movie, and that is the director Jess Franco. Probably in my travels the most prolific director I have ever come across. He was a Spanish director. He's from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, even into the 90s. He really specialized in the world of exploitation, but he also um, very interesting. He wasn't just a horror director. He did all kinds of styles. I mean, you name it, he did it. But I have a lot of his films. I love his work to death, and again, there's so many great films to pick out from his career. He did so many great giallo films. It's weird. I realized no real giallo films made this list, but I think giallo is one of my favorite styles. It just kind of happened to be the way this whole thing panned out. But probably my favorite Jess Franco movie is Mansion of the Living Dead. Um, One of the descriptions of this movie is it literally says, in a nutshell, this movie is fucking insane. And that pretty much sums it up. This movie is so freaking sleazy. It's kind of like a ghost story. It has an occult element, but it's just bonkers crazy. It's super demented, and again, it's got such amazing, amazing atmosphere. It came out in 1985. Just incredible. But it's such a sleazy movie. There's all of these kind of lesbian sex scenes in the movie, and Jess Franco shot a lot of his films in these like really over the top, like gorgeous, exotic locations, and the cinematography in this movie is spectacular. And again, it's got lots of different elements. Very sleazy. I kind of almost feel like this movie is a sex exploitation movie in some ways, with a kind of ghost story theme thrown in, and it has a zombie kind of element, and so It's got like three different kinds of things going on, and it's pretty bizarre. It's pretty out there, but amazing, amazing movie. This movie is such a thrilling experience. I had never seen this movie before. The Blu-ray transfer for this movie is like out of this world. It's gorgeous. And again, it's so hard to pick. I love, love, love Jess Franco. He's one of my favorite directors. This might be my favorite movie of his. At the end of the day, I just love it. I mean, and not even haven't even gotten into his amazing giallo films. So amazing, amazing movie. This next movie I think is like I am a huge fan of vampire movies. Huge fan of Dracula films. My favorite kind of monster oriented kind of film. I'm more of a werewolf guy. I love werewolf movies. I love werewolf movies probably the most out of those kinds of genre films. But I do love, great vampire movies, great, Dracula movies. And oh my fucking god, this movie just blew my mind the first time I saw it. I had heard about this movie. I think I saw it a couple times when I was a little kid. I had not seen it in years. And that is Dracula vs. Frankenstein. This movie is like one of the most ridiculous movies ever made, but yet again, it's fucking amazing. And I really feel that this film, which came out in 71, is just, it's mind-boggling that this came out in 71. And it was directed by A.R. Adamson. Xander Vorkov plays Dracula, and I think he actually plays, I think his version of Dracula is, I have to say, it's so ridiculous and terrible in so many ways, but I also feel it's like his version of Dracula is one of my favorite versions of all time. Like, this movie it's a movie you have to see to believe. Like, it's so painfully low budget, oh, but just amazing. It's so entertaining. But I think it, really is um, like a classic monster movie. I think it does, when it comes to a good vampire movie and a good Frankenstein movie, which I also love Frankenstein movies a lot. It delivers the goods. But again, it's like I kind of almost think of this movie as like a comedy more than anything else. But it definitely has those great, kind of serious horror elements that give it a little bit of seriousness to it. So it's not just total schlock, even though it is. It has that resonation to it, but again, this is an unbelievable masterpiece. I've seen this movie so many fucking times. Like, I bought this a couple of years ago, and I had seen it a few times as a kid, but it had been years, years and years since I saw it, and I have completely fallen in love with this movie. It is truly one of the best monster movies I think ever made. One of the greatest exploitation movies ever made. It's got this great kind of it came out in 71, so it has a very um, you know uh, psychedelic quality to it. It's so fabulous. It's the shit. It's the cat's meow. I can never say enough good things about this movie. So yeah, so amazing. And one of my well, I'm a huge fan of European horror exploitation movies. So many great Italian directors that came out in the 60s and 70s putting out just all these great exploitation movies. But I have to say, I've talked about this director, and I've also talked about this film uh, many, many times. I've done multiple shows on it, and I've talked multiple times about my favorite. My favorite Italian director of all time is the maestro Lucio Fulci. He is like hands down my favorite Italian director. If you're like new to horror, and I see it happens a lot. I've gotten into some debates about it with people where, they kind of I don't know. They don't give. They like the old school '80s, American slasher movies, or the old school. I've seen that happen a lot with people where they'll talk about, yeah, I'm really into slasher movies, and I love, my favorite slasher movie is Halloween 1978, or they'll say, yeah, my first foray into horror was Nightmare on Elm Street, the original movies, or Friday 13th. And I love those fucking movies to death. Friday 13th franchise is my favorite horror franchise of all time. I love those fucking movies. But a lot of the times what I see is like, to me, that's where the reference point ends as far as horror. And I think like, horror is a huge, huge genre. And I think it really, in order to kind of get a picture of the scope of horror, you have to go back a little bit further and see what movies came out, before 1981. I mean, because there was a shit ton of movies coming out in Europe for like, over 10 years before those movies came out. And not at all discrediting, what the impact that Nightmare and Friday 13th had, and John Carpenter's Halloween. I mean, those are masterpieces, and I love those movies. But, in regards to Italian directors, especially Lucio Fulci, and there's so many great directors: Mario Bava, Bruno Mattei, of course, the legendary Dario Argento, um, and a whole slew of others that were just important, important. And so I see that ignored a lot of the times and not given credit, for being, well, these guys kind of started the horror genre, especially when it comes to the slasher genre, especially when it comes to movies that we all know and love that have incredible kills, copious amounts of violence and boobs, everything that we love in movies. You know, Lucio Fulci was one of those guys that was doing it many years before. And he is one of my all-time favorite directors. He's definitely my favorite Italian director. And again, so many masterpieces he was responsible for directing. But again, it comes down to my favorite movie of all time of his work is House by the Cemetery. This movie is the bomb diggity. I've seen this movie so many goddamn times. It's insane. And this was a movie I used to see all the time when I was a kid. This, I believe, when I was a kid, this was the first kind of Italian horror movie I'd ever seen. And this package is just immaculate. Like, there's hours of special features. So there's amazing documentaries about this movie. Again, Lucio Fulci, so many great films. I actually have one of his other films in this collection too, which I think is my one of my favorites. But House by the Cemetery, oh my God, like, talk about atmosphere. Lucio Fulci was all about atmosphere for me, and nobody did it better than Lucio Fulci, as far as I'm concerned. Like, the atmosphere is so haunting and terrifying and otherworldly and it's so strong and rich that you can taste it. This movie exemplifies that. Just such a masterpiece. I've talked about this movie many times. I've done multiple shows on it, but my God, um, you know, if you've never seen this movie, or for that matter, a Lucio Fulci movie, but especially this movie, you gotta, no offense, but you gotta get with the program, because he's the OG, he's the man. So amazing, so amazing. This movie that I'm going to be talking about next is probably, out of all of these movies, is probably the most well known, the most celebrated. It's one of those movies that people who are not necessarily into the world of low budget exploitation, they all know about it. I think this movie is you know has this appeal and is so popular, obviously in the cult world, but in the commercial world too. I think everybody and their grandmother knows about this movie, rightfully so, because it's it's a masterpiece. And I have a long history with this movie, like millions of other people, and that is the original Killer Clowns from Outer Space. I think, one of the greatest low budget exploitation movies ever. It's one of my favorite horror science fiction movies ever. Also, this movie was a trailblazer, one of the most influential movies, groundbreaking, unlike anything else when it had come out. I think one of the most important movies in the world of science fiction, exploitation, horror. It is, I think that if this movie didn't exist, the world of film would be a lot different because I feel like this movie was such an influential movie, and one of the most entertaining movies of all time. It was directed by Stephen Chiodo, the Chiodo brothers. A total mom and pop production, and just so incredible with how well it just exemplifies what you know if people have a real, you have these creative people that have a sense of purpose, but they have just like an incredible sense of imagination, but yet they have no money to get that imagination on the big screen. This is the example of like how you can pull that off, and it's miraculous. Like, it's a masterpiece. I've seen this movie. This was a movie I grew up watching as a kid. It's a beloved movie of mine. It's one of my to-go-to movies. I have multiple versions of this movie, VHS, DVD. I used to see it all the time on cable as a kid. And I got this really sweet Blu-ray edition. There's like 2 or 3 hours of special features that is just so in depth and so interesting. And again, definitely the most talked about movie in all of these movies that I'm talking about now. But oh my God, what a masterpiece! I never get sick of this movie. And super creepy, super campy, super funny. Just and I don't know. It's such an incredibly strange movie too. I love this movie. It's so entertaining. I think it's a love letter to all things science fiction and horror too. I mean, you can see the influences that this movie, all the movies from like the 50s and 60s, all the classic sci-fi movies that were such an influence on this movie. It's kind of a love letter to that bygone era of filmmaking. Amazing. Amazing, amazing. This next movie I'm going to talk about is when I first started doing my YouTube channel, this was one of the first movies I talked about. And I did a big show on this when I was just doing the Facebook live videos, when that's all I was doing as far as like content and trying this new thing with video. This was one of those movies that I talked about, and I've done multiple shows on it. And I think that this is easily one of the sleaziest movies I've ever seen and one of the most disturbing movies. It's got one or two sequences in it that I just think is just kind of hard to watch and so weird and so eerie and so bizarre. But I love this movie to death, and that is Castle of the Creeping Flesh. This movie is, I don't know, it's kind of fucked and tremendous. It's such a, it's a classic kind of gothic horror film, but it's so sleazy. It's like a sex exploitation movie, but it's definitely a horror movie, and it's kind of got this almost like a psychosexual kind of element around it. Sex is very much a part of it, but again, it's a gothic kind of horror film at its core. And but I love this movie. I bought this totally on a whim. I had heard a little bit about this, um, you know, in passing here and there, and I was just like, "Holy shit, this movie just completely rules." It came out, and the other thing about this movie, that is just mind blowing. This also was put out by Severin. This movie came out in 68, which is like completely fucking nuts. Um, and again, it's easily one of the sleaziest movies I've ever seen. It's so trashy, and it was directed by a really talented Adrian Hoven, who is pretty big force. He was a pretty big force in Germany in the world of exploitation, and you have to. This is one of those movies you have to see to believe it. And it was written by Adrian Hover, and it was directed by Percy C. Parker. But again, this movie is not for the faint of heart. It is truly unsettling, and there are scenes in this movie that are generally hard to watch. But again, it's such a damn good movie. I love this movie to death. This Blu-ray package of this movie is amazing. This is easily one of my favorite kind of hard exploitation movies of all time. I think it's essential. It's super deranged, but and again, I would go into it with caution because of the subject matter and certain kinds of graphic things around this movie. But holy fuck, it's amazing, 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 amazing. This next movie is a movie I discovered a few years ago. Bought it on a total whim, and I've seen this movie. I don't know, probably 8 or 9 times since I bought it. It is such a great movie. I'm a huge fan of science fiction, and especially when science fiction and horror are combined. This movie, Prey, is spectacular. Just pure science fiction, horror, exploitation, and it's a very sleazy, kind of graphic movie as well. Super bizarre, but copious amounts of blood, especially the ending. There's such a great series of kills. It's very gory, but it's such an awesome, awesome movie. And again, I never seen this movie before, but this is one of my favorites. I have watched this movie multiple times. It came out in 1977. Again, it's one of those things that so ahead of its time. Like I'm always amazed. I'm like, holy shit, this came out in the 70s, like 77, and it's still, really, it still has this like thrilling quality to it. It was directed by Norman Warren, and it's a British exploitation movie. And again, it's got everything. It's got the sex exploitation vibe, a science fiction exploitation vibe, and definitely a monster movie kind of vibe to it, and of course the horror science fiction vibe. And it's a very strange, bizarre movie. Also, this transfer of this film on Blu-ray is just simply spectacular. There's all kinds of great special features on here. Again, I bought this totally cold, not knowing anything about it, and I was just, holy shit, I couldn't believe it when I watched it. Just a masterpiece. 77 was a damn good year. I can't recommend this movie enough. Definitely one of my favorites of all time. And again, I always talk about the, tracing. If you're into a certain style, whatever it is, it can be film, it can be dance, it can be, you know, writing, or, movies in this case, music. If you discover a certain style, I always find it fascinating and interesting if you try to you get into the artists or the people that kind of piqued your curiosity initially, but then you start diving into like, wow, okay, how what were these guys influenced by, or were there people who were doing similar work before them, and that whole kinds of thing. That kind of method of like tracing like the lineage. And one of my all-time favorite directors, I think, in the horror genre as a whole, probably the most important director, and that is Herschel Gordon Lewis. I'm a huge Herschel Gordon Lewis fan. I love his movies. I own pretty much all of his films. I discovered him about probably about 7 or 8 years ago, and I just became obsessed with his work. I own most of his films on Blu-ray for a really long time, and it's interesting talking about lineage. But like when I first saw, Friday 13th or Halloween, or which were probably the first horror movies I ever saw, or or slasher films I'd ever seen before. It was the first time I'd ever seen, you know, blood and gore in a movie. And of course, they came out in 78 and 80, 81. Those were, that was the first time I'd ever seen gore in a film. And so over the years, I've obviously got way into horror films and have discovered all kinds of new films and directors and styles and all these things. And to me, it's about the lineage. Like, where does this stuff? Everything has a starting point, and I feel like I was always curious, like, where did the gore, when was that kind of introduced into film, like as far as showing gratuitous violence or sex, or like practical effects. Like, I'm a huge fan of gore and practical effects. Not a big fan of CGI. I think CGI can be used effectively, but a lot of the times I'm not really into it. I'm a practical effects guy. So I was always curious, where does that come back? Where did that start? And then as over the years, I got more into and got reintroduced to a lot of the great Italian directors. And at one point, I reached this conclusion. Okay, directors like Dario Argento or Bruno Mattei or Lucio Fulci, these guys, these Italian directors were probably the first guys to capture, were the first ones to use practical effects in their horror films. Lots of blood and things like that. And then a couple of years after that, I discovered Herschel Gordon Lewis, and I reached the conclusion after digging into his work and really admiring his work and just loving the shit out of his movies, that he's kind of the godfather. He kind of started gore in films. He was the first person. And I think probably the most important film in his career. Overall, my favorite. I love all of his films. Probably my favorite film of all time is Blood Feast. This movie is such a masterpiece. I think this movie was the originator of gore, and he's known as the Godfather of gore, and rightfully so. This came out in 1963. Fucking nuts, fucking nuts how old this movie is. And so he was making these gore drenched movies before anyone else. And again, he's one of my favorite directors. I love his shit to death, and I own most of his work. But I have to say, Blood Feast is probably my favorite of his work. These the editions that I have of his films, especially this one, are just amazing. There's like 2 discs to each set. Transfer is amazing, and it goes into, there's all these great documentaries. There's all these great interviews with Herschel Gordon Lewis himself. And I think that this movie it's it's funny. Again, it goes back to the same kind of thing. This movie is so fucking awful and terrible and schlocky, but just again, it's so amazing and it's so fucking fun. It's just such a fun ride, and I just love this movie to death. It's so utterly ridiculous. It's so gory and bizarre, and it's a slasher movie also. And to think that this came out when it did is mind blowing. And I think all his films are essential. If you're into horror, like his films are all essential, especially exploitation. But you know, I think his films are probably not for everyone because they're really out to lunch, to put it mildly, and they're pretty bad, but they're just fascinating. It's fascinating that some of these movies got made, but I just love them. And I would say the movie to definitely check out in his career is Blood Feast. I think this is probably, well, it was his most successful movie, but I think it was his most influential and probably his best movie, and probably um, you know just is an example of all of those things. Like, I think it's his, also his most important movie I think that he ever made. His biggest probably contribution to the world of horror. And like him or not, I mean, this movie was he was doing it before anyone else. So essential movie. So this next movie is again another Lucio Fulci movie. Like I said before, my favorite Italian director, and I think that close second, kind of tied for first, along with House by the Cemetery. But I think that this movie is one of the sleaziest movies ever made. It might be the sleaziest movie ever made. It exemplifies the art of a true slasher film, and that is the one and only the uh, a legendary film, and that is the New York Ripper. I fucking love this movie. This movie is so dirty. You feel like you have to. I feel every time I watch this movie, I got to take a shower after. You have to like take take a shower. It's just like outrageous and amazing and deeply disturbing. The kills are just ferocious as all hell. It doesn't get any more gripping and envelope pushing for that matter than this movie. It's uh, it's an experience. This movie is actually very much talked about and very well respected. It's probably for what it is, one of the more popular or well-known movies of Lucio Fulci's career. But this movie means so much to me in a weird way, and but I just find this movie to be such a so entertaining, and it's such a visceral experience, and I just love this movie. And to think that this came out in '82, I mean, talk about so ahead of its time. Another example of a movie that could not be made today in any way, shape, or form. But this transfer is amazing. This package is amazing. There's all kinds of great documentaries. Again, it was put out by Blue Underground, an amazing company. This is an essential movie if you're a fan of horror, without a doubt. And even if it is too much for a person to watch, you have to kind of give props to this movie as being such a fucking trailblazer. Amazing. So this, I have one more movie to go, and then this Odyssey will be over. This has been an hour and almost an hour and 24 minutes. So this newer or last movie I'm going to be talking about is a new discovery that I got into 2 years ago, and it's part of the whole. There's a whole nother. It's always interesting discovering movies, and that there's apparently these like, you have your genre films, but then there's like these odd kind of subgenre films within that. And this is a movie that was shot on video intentionally, and it's basically like, when I discovered this movie, discovered that there's this whole other subgenre in the horror element in the kind of exploitation world that is where the movies are all shot deliberately on video to give it this real grady, kind of shitty look. And I kind of feel like I have seen, pretty good amount of movies in this style, and I have to say that this movie is like kind of the godfather of that. Like it's a masterpiece, and it's a complete and utter piece of shit at the same time, but this movie is just amazing in every way, and that is Suburban Sasquatch. One of the most ridiculous movies ever made, and yet one of the greatest movies. I think this movie's genius. As bad and as terrible as it all works for it. It is such a fucking riot. I remember I brought this movie over to a party, to this dinner party, and a couple of the friends that I knew that were there are into movies, and they have a pretty open mind, and they like goofy stuff and weird shit. So I brought this over and I talked it up, and then I made everybody sit down and watch it, and they they the reaction that I got from everyone was like, what is this? What the fuck is this? Like, I don't know, they just didn't get it. It was really awkward. I was the only one laughing and into it, and we were watching it, and they were all just like, and it was super awkward, and they were just like, what the fuck is it? Like, they didn't get into it, and they didn't like kind of understand like that it was, kind of intentional, but then it was also the way the movie was kind of made, and the whole kind of vibe of the film was, it was kind of intentional, but then it was also due to the extreme technical or financial limitations to the movie. So it was like a little bit of both, and plus it was like, I kind of think of this movie as a party movie. It's not meant to be taken seriously anyway. So like they didn't know how to react. It was really fucking funny. But I love this movie to death. It is such a masterpiece. It's easily one of my favorite movies of all time. Um, it came out in 2002. So it's a newer movie ish. But it's an obsession of mine. I can't get enough of this movie. I think it's a complete masterpiece. It was directed by David Waskafovich, who is really well known in this kind of genre. He's made a lot of weird and fucking wacky shot on video movies. The interview on here by him is so fucking hilarious because he like comes across as being like uber serious, and it's just great. But this movie is just a masterpiece. I love this fucking movie to death, and I can watch. This is one of those movies I can literally throw in any time of the day. I don't have to be in a certain mood. I can just. This movie is just so goddamn entertaining. It's totally like. I look at this as just being this like kind of schlock comedy. I mean, definitely a horror movie, but and it's a great kind of Bigfoot's tale. But oh my god, this movie is such a masterpiece, and it's a fucking party to go as far as I'm concerned. So, thanks again. I know this was a long video. It's for me. It was actually a lot of work compiling an actual list of films, and with so many movies that I love to talk about. But this has been a blast. So maybe I'll do some more of these shows. If you can check out this video and actually sit through me talking about these movies for this long, great. And maybe I'll do more shows like this. But thanks again, and this has been a super super fun time, and we will see you next time. Peace.